Hi, and welcome to the War Room. Every time I speak with Elena Hutchison, she pushes me to think differently and to also rethink the assumptions I didn't even know I was making. And this conversation is no different. In this episode, we speak with Elena about how much innovation is happening outside the traditional enterprise ready box and what gets overlooked when credibility is tied to scale instead of signal. Enjoy the episode.
Analyst relations is obviously incredibly strategic, right? I was a chief strategy officer, but this is how I got there because I was playing a role in what products did we develop, what markets did we enter, what M&A were we involved with. Because analysts and analyst relations and the ways that it touches go-to-market strategy, sales strategy, marketing strategy, product strategy, right? All of that stuff. Analyst relations can be an incredibly strategic tool, particularly for entering new markets, for M&A, for all of these like big executive team decisions. Where I think a lot of AR people get stuck is that they're not at the table where those decisions are being made. And that makes sense because, those are really close to the vest decisions. When you're entering a new market, when you're doing it, those are things that happen kind of at an executive team level, right? And then you bring in a few director level, VP level people across the business where you need them to get directly involved with that thing. And so the trick is, how do we make AR be one of those things? And I think, I think that has to come from the way you behave in the business long before this moment is happening, right? So the way, and I take on coaching clients, and the way I think about it with them is, how are we systematically mapping ourselves to the senior executives in this business and making sure that we are adding value to them systematically, right? That means, do we understand our high-level product roadmap and the big questions that are in it, right? Strategic questions around our AI strategy or the big acquisition targets that we might be thinking about, right? Do I understand all of that stuff? Do I understand what marketing challenges we're having and how, analyst input might feed into that? Do I understand our biggest challenges from a sales perspective? So that I can then go back into my huge database of relevant analysts, relevant writing, relevant market intelligence, right? I've got all of these amazing databases from Forrester, Gartner, IDC, whoever else I'm working with, and I have access to the actual people who wrote those things. And so I can then, with the benefit of those questions, go back and start to explore, where could we be doing? Where should we be thinking about M&A activity? Where could we be thinking about automating some part of our sales tech stack to solve a problem that we have, right? But if I don't understand what those questions are, if I'm not trying to systematically map myself to the members of the executive team and what questions they have, then they're not going to know me to involve me in those types of questions. So, problem number one for an analyst relations person who's trying to get to this table and have a strategic impact is, how am I showing up every day? Do the people in this business look at me as a strategic resource? And what am I doing to, kind of set myself up that way?
So, do you think this is the reason why analyst relations typically is isolated within marketing and communications, and we don't move beyond that in most of the time?
I think it can be, right? A lot of analyst relations people behave as though they're meeting setters, right? Their job is to not really know the business, but liaise with the business, right? And if that's your mindset, if when you get, my business is a lot of waves and MQs, right? So I think about things in terms of that. If you get a wave questionnaire or an MQ questionnaire and you look at it and all you can do is kind of say, that question goes to product, that question goes to marketing, that question goes to sales, and you don't know the answers or whether the questions are good for you or bad for you, then you're not thinking strategically. You're a project manager. And that's fine. Like, there are perfectly good analyst relations project managers who understand how to use the tools of analyst relations, and they understand what an inquiry is, what a briefing is, like how to tactically do that stuff. But those people are not going to be strategic in their impact, right? A strategic analyst relations person gets it's a questionnaire like that and understands, oh crap, that question is the question we were hoping we didn't show up in here. And I hope the weight of that thing isn't too high because we still don't have that on our roadmap quite yet. How are we going to position against that? And that's the difference, right? A strategic AR person is thinking about the business holistically. They have their fingers in a little bit of sales, a little bit of marketing, a little bit of product, and they're constantly at the table sharing, kind of being the voice of analysts, right? Sharing that market input in every room. ideally, and adding that strategic input. But not a lot of AR people, not every AR person operates in that way. And if you're not, then you don't really have it is unlikely that you're going to be called upon to participate in, in M&A or some of these kind of sexier, more fun things that you could be doing.
Yeah, exactly. And big part of that is on us because we are not glorified schedulers, meeting schedulers. We can be really strategic and we can bring a lot of value to the business. So, Elena, you were the Chief Strategy Officer at Medallia. Before that, you ran the analyst relations function focused specifically on analyst relations. And your company was a leader in several Magic Quadrants and waves. How did you integrate analyst relations into your strategic planning process?
Well, we treated it very much as a key part of the a key input into our strategic planning, right? So because I had and I should step back. My background before I started doing analyst relations was in sales. So I think that really changes how I thought about analyst relations, right? I think if you end up in analyst relations through other parts of the business, you may not have such a holistic view of what the company needs from you. My entry into it. Sorry, did you have a question?
Yeah. Can I ask you why your sales background changed the way you looked at analyst relations?
Because I think if you come from a marketing background, then your view of analyst relations is probably mostly content marketing, right? We participate in analyst relations to get mentioned in analyst things because those are things we can license. And when we license stuff, we get leads. And my job is to get more leads. We have a certain number of leads we're supposed to get, right? It's all about kind of what part of the business did you grow up in and what goals are you trying to drive forward. So a lot of people in analyst relations get raised in marketing. I don't think anybody goes to college to learn analyst relations, so everybody gets raised somewhere. But a lot of people come out of marketing, right? And so they come from this framework of my job is to get more stuff written because stuff written is stuff licensed and stuff licensed is leads, right? I came from sales. And so I was a sales engineer. That was my background. Because I was a sales engineer, I understood how this stuff was actually getting used. And that is to say, like a wave or a magic quadrant, or even like a piece of thought leadership content or a total economic impact study, like any of those pieces, I had seen firsthand. My first introduction to analyst relations was how are we using that in a sales cycle? To get a lead, maybe, but more importantly, to advance a sales cycle, to take someone from interested in us to down selecting us, to take a customer who, maybe wants to buy us to a point where they really feel like they have a solid business case, right? In the case of a total economic impact type of report, right? So I had seen those things get used in the field to drive revenue. And that changes how you think about the importance of them and how you do the math on what here matters and doesn't matter. And so I think I brought a different perspective when I started analyst relations because I had come from such a commercial part of the business. I also had I had a lot of literacy around product because I was a sales engineer. So I knew what parts of our product worked well, what parts of our product maybe needed some work. And maybe in some ways I was very prepared to use analyst relations, to weaponize analyst relations to get the stuff in the product done that needed to be done commercially, right? And so I just think that mindset of I understood more parts of the business than the average analyst relations person did. And I brought all of that to what we were doing. So when I was talking to an analyst, I understood how what that person was saying might relate to sales cycles, or it could relate to other products in the market that we could acquire, which was something that started coming up in my last several years at Medallia. So, I think when you bring a broader perspective, not just about functions at the business, but about how those functions tie together to drive revenue, right? To drive, operating margin, to really drive some of the things that the executives in the business care about. If you're articulate about those things, then suddenly you sound like a person who belongs at the table, right? You can explain why acquiring a certain company could create cross-sell opportunities, could, add better margin because of the way it goes to market, could, add revenue to put you in a new tier, right? That's how executives are talking. And because of where I came from, I was already speaking that way.
Yeah. Because if we don't speak the language of the executives and speak our language, which is something that analyst relations often do, we're talking to ourselves and we're talking a language that people don't understand.
And analyst relations is this is a game of translation, right? Not just, it's so interesting how you put that, because so much of, I was just working with a client and we were prepping some of their references for a major evaluation. And that is a game of translation, right? The analyst is going to ask you about, do we do X? We call it Y. And just so you know, this thing you built that's Y is what the analyst means when they ask you about X, right? Simple translation. But that customer was going to need that translation to understand that when the analyst asks whether we do X, the answer is yes. And it's really important that they understand that, right? Analyst relations is about understanding, how do different people talk about things, and how do I make sure that we're communicating as clearly as we possibly can be across people who maybe don't all speak the same language, right? Clients and analysts, and with us in the middle sort of translating. So yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, right? It's all about translating different parts of the business to an analyst, translating what you're trying to do in a way that they will get, translating what your customers are doing in a way that resonates, that they can explain to other prospective buyers. We sit in this communications hub, and the more languages you speak, the more lethal you can be.
Absolutely. And the better friends you are with the different teams, the more
Yeah.
you know about the business, because you don't need a reason to go to product marketing or to go to product management and say to them, can you explain to me about this product if the company has several products? Or can you explain to me how our product functions in this vertical? If how our functions in that vertical. And
Yep.
being able to articulate this and translate the language of analyst relations into the language of the CEO, into the language of the CFO, into the language of the CMO, and show how we can bring value, whether it's bringing more money for the CFO, whether it's raising the profile of the company, or shortening the sales cycle, it doesn't matter. As long as we bring value and we are able to articulate it, we'll always have buy-in from the senior leadership. And I think, and it would be interesting to hear your perspective, but I think we need a change of perspective, and a change of how we look at ourselves, and not look at ourselves as this kind of very niche, very narrow part of the company, but look at ourselves as the strategic core that can help the various teams.
I think that's right. You and I spent like an hour talking before we even hit record on this.
Okay.
But one of the things that I think is really interesting is kind of this existential, where is analyst relations in 5 years or 10 years? And I was just reading this morning about kind of applications of AI in analyst relations. So there's a couple of interesting things that are going to happen, right? One is you're seeing, I advise a company that does RFP, filling out, right? So it will help you take old RFPs and fill in new questionnaires. And if you think about it, analysts are also likely to, use AI to parse all of the questionnaires that they get in a major evaluation and analyze what they're getting from that. But at a certain point, you can just skip that whole process and start to have the analyst AI just read the product documentation, right? That exists at a company. And so where does the analyst relations professional fit into that? If you're not adding a strategic value, in other words, if your only job is to take the inbound questionnaire, project manage the filling out of that across the business, make sure that that's happening, that is the job that can be replaced by AI and will be, I think. If your job is to take that questionnaire and apply, critical thinking about what you know around the business's goals, what you know about the competitive landscape, who might have tried to get that question in there worded exactly that way. That's the kind of stuff that would be very, very hard to replicate through AI. And so, I think it's an interesting question around where does this, as, evaluations get more frequent, which I think they will in this world, where do you fit in? Because the strategic value that you add will get higher as you are helping marketing and product and everybody else think through what information are we putting out so that Gartner, Forrester, IDC have access to it. How do we make sure that that stuff is up to date in ways that will make us look good? Even how do we show up in LLMs, right? Becomes kind of, it's AR adjacent, right? If we're showing up in ChatGPT, we're showing up that way to Gartner too. So don't I have to be thinking about that? So the aperture of what I need to be thinking about as an analyst relations professional widens, but only if I'm thinking beyond that questionnaire that shows up and just project managing the filling of it. right? It's an interesting proposition when you think about it. A little scary, but also kind of exciting.
Talk to me more about the acquisitions that you made at Medallia and how analyst relations and analysts help you to decide and to make those big calls and make them right.
This is a great question because I think it will kind of help me get at another point I wanted to make about when and where analysts can be helpful. So we made a bunch of acquisitions at Medallia. Some of them analysts were incredibly helpful in. Others of them analysts could not have been helpful at all in, and I'll explain why. So sometimes we were acquiring technologies that were either pretty new, didn't have a lot of users yet, or had Medallia was a very enterprise implementation, pretty high services, very much sold through a sales-led motion. And so one of the things we were very interested in is acquiring products that were a little bit more product-led, right? Can we acquire some technologies that people can implement themselves a little bit more, that grow in a different way? What we found was those are the kinds of technologies that analysts often will not have a ton of insight about. And why is that? Well, it's because you don't actually need to talk to an analyst to buy something product-led, right? If something has a product-led go-to-market, then I don't need to de-risk it by talking to an analyst in the same way. Maybe I need to de-risk like the security of it or whether that company is going to be in it for the long term. Like there might be some things that I need to talk to an analyst about. But if the go-to-market really is product-led, then like I can just build it and get my hands on it, right? And so once I've done that basic vetting and I understand that this is a product that can grow with me and that's secure enough for me to use, and I've gone through that kind of basic vetting, I'll just buy some licenses and start messing with it and start using it. So what we found was for products like that, analysts don't always have a ton of insight because they're not talking to the buyers of those products necessarily, unless they don't work and then they've got to migrate onto a different product, right? But if a product has a product-led growth curve and is working pretty well, then, the traditional kind of vendor-oriented analysts aren't necessarily covering that thing because enterprise buyers don't need a lot of advice about that. The advice is go try it, see if it works for your business, put your hands on it and see if it works. On the flip side, things that do have a little bit more of an enterprise go-to-market, enterprise implementation, enterprise sales cycle, right? That's the stuff where the major analyst firms are very involved. And so for those, what we found was if you think about what analysts are doing, they're talking to buyers, they're talking to prospects, they're helping with RFPs. They get a lot of stories of what worked, what didn't work, what stuff do we wish this product did that it doesn't do. Mostly horror stories, a lot of horror stories, and great stories if those exist. And so, I remember one M&A target where we ended up speaking with the analyst. We'd kind of been through the data room, right? When you're doing these things, there's a big data room. The company will kind of give you like their client lists and their renewal dates and all of that sort of stuff. Like you have it, but it's very two-dimensional. Like you're sort of, this was during COVID, so you're in your house and you're looking at a screen and you're trying to get a sense of this company by like looking at the stuff at the files that are in this room. Getting on the phone with an analyst and hearing firsthand, like what kinds of inquiries are you getting about this product? What do you hear about it from people who have implemented it? Really helped make our decision because it gave the texture that we just, when you meet with the executive team and you get a demo, you get the most beautiful, perfect thing. When you look at the data room, you get something kind of flat. But talking to the analyst could give us like this very unvarnished perspective of just like what is happening in the market that we really couldn't get any other way, right? Any one customer is biased. They either love it or hate it. Analysts talk to a lot of customers in the right market, but you do have to be really careful that you are talking to an analyst who is talking to buyers in that market. Not every go-to-market has that dynamic. So, you just have to be careful. We found that it was true in some cases and then really not true in others.
Can you talk to me about the process that you implemented to make sure that you're talking to the right analysts? You mentioned that some of the analysts were right for that conversation and were very helpful. Some of the analysts weren't right and weren't helpful. What process did you implement to make sure that you are talking to the right analysts and that they can be
This is
helpful
an
as well?
interesting question. I mean, I think you have to be skeptical as you asking quantitative questions like how many inquiries have you taken on this? Both I believe Forrester and Gartner both have this information. I don't know if it's true of IDC, and other analysts, may or may not make it public, but asking how many inquiries like this have you taken? Can you give me a sense of how many people like this you have spoken to in the last X amount of time, right? I would really try to quantify that so that you have a sense of, is this somebody's gut feeling? How many conversations along this line has this person really had? Like, how many data points is the feedback I'm getting really based on? Because and then again, you should also apply your judgment, right? There are certain things that we know about who has a Forrester or Gartner or IDC seat license. And if you're working with a firm that's not one of those three, then you need to be asking that question. How does a customer come to have access to this research or to you? Are they paying? Are they, like, how did they get here to be doing an inquiry with you or asking you this question? Because that can have inherent, not bias in it, but it can tell you something about where's this person's perspective and what kinds of buyers are they likely to hear from that may or may not be congruent with who you're trying to sell to. And if this analyst only has customers who fit a profile that's not your ICP, then they are inherently not useful, even if they can answer the questions that you have, right? You could ask them the questions and it might be useful to hear what they have to say, but you shouldn't weight it so heavily because they're actually not talking to your buyer. You've got to be really careful about that. Analysts are confident people. That's sort of like part of the job description, right? Is like take confident point, can pound the table about points of view. And so you do have to be really skeptical about, does this person really have the right amount of data and the right point of view to pound the table about the thing I'm asking. And you should not feel afraid to ask questions about how much data they have that's weighing into an opinion if you aren't sure.
So let's say you have asked all those questions, you have got the answers that you were looking for, and you've decided, okay, so these analysts or that analyst is a good person to speak to. They will be very helpful. How do you make sure that you get the most out of them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not sure I've totally nailed the answer to this. I think we already talked about some of it, right? Getting them quantitative. How many times have you had this conversation? I think one of the things that just is always helpful is understanding how often is the problem this thing solved coming up. How often is this concept, this topic, this space coming up in inquiry? And you have to be a little bit careful with new spaces because, as you can have an analyst over here that covers one space and an analyst over here that covers a different space. And if you're sort of in an emerging third space, it can get a little weird with who's taking that stuff. So you have to really understand, maybe the analyst I'm talking to only takes half of those inquiries if the person has a certain title or whatever. You want to understand all of that. Like, how are people getting to this person? What questions are they asking? And so I would often in these conversations try to get into that. How is inquiry volume on this topic changing? What is what the people are asking for changing in this area? When you talk to people, when you're helping people with an RFP or you are helping people recover from software that didn't implement well or any of those kind of negative outcomes, what went wrong, right? Because what I'm trying to understand for us is, what is the likelihood that the product we're acquiring or the market that we're entering, that we're going to be able to solve that thing uniquely. And then I also often, if this is an analyst that I trust, I want to run the pitch by them. Like, why would we buy this thing? If this is who we were and we make this acquisition, then, we would be trying to tell the market that 1 + 1 = 3. Do you buy that? What concerns do you think the market would have, right? What holes would people poke in that? What assumptions that we're making are right? What assumptions that we're making are you skeptical about, right? Analysts are also pretty naturally skeptical, and so it's a good thing to lean into. Tell us why we're wrong. They love to tell you all the reasons why you're wrong. And that's really useful, right? Because a lot of time, sometimes it's things you're actually wrong about. Sometimes it's places in your pitch that have a little rough spot, and you could try to smooth that rough spot before you're actually out in the world doing it. So, and all of these questions can also be asked about, investors. Sometimes you can get a sense of, well, what other investors are calling about this stuff. What questions are you getting from the finance community on these topics? Those are relevant too when you're talking about M&A.
How should you? So you mentioned that analysts are quite skeptical naturally, especially when you go to them and you
You
say,
think
we
so?
have no. um, yeah, I was going to say, especially when you go to them and say, we haven't got any competitors and we're the market. How can you utilize this skepticism?
I just try to lean into it, right? And so, occasionally you will get an analyst who's like a cheerleader analyst, and there you've got to push them to be skeptical. But the vast majority of analysts, I think that's their default, right? Skepticism is where they naturally are, and that's great. For M&A, I'm not trying to get a cheerleader, right? It doesn't actually do me any good to have someone be like, "That's an amazing idea, you should go for it." Right? That's great for a press release, and I would love to have them quoted and write a blog post. So wonderful. But I think I want to know all the reasons why they're skeptical. If this fails spectacularly, why will that have been? If the market reacts negatively to this, what do you think are the biggest risks? How do you think, our competitors are going to react to this if we did it? How do you think our big clients would react to it? How do you think customers who are in this other, we had multiple markets that we were in. How would customers in multiple markets of ours potentially be reacting to this? And I think analysts are pretty good at assuming that they're talking to the buyer I want them to be representing. They're pretty good at putting on that hat and imagining, okay, I am a customer of this ICP at this size. Like, how would I react to this offering? And giving you the the concerns, the things that are exciting, and kind of giving you that holistic reaction. They can stand in pretty well for customers, again, assuming that they're actually talking to those customers, which is a big asterisk that you have to clear first. But if you're with an analyst who's doing that, then asking them to kind of role play and react to, here's our pitch, like what would be exciting about that pitch to you? Who do you think you would be kind of competing against? Like, where would we fit in the market relative to what else is there? What concerns would you have? Questions would you have? Skepticism would you have? Like, they're really good at answering those kinds of questions. I mean, my whole career has been in market research. And as I was thinking on this, like, analysts really are just another form of market research, right? They're talking to your buyer and they can come to you and represent the buyer. And so I would use them that way. You're speaking for this person we're going to go talk to. What do you think? And I find they're pretty good at giving you the bad case, which is fine. That's what you need.
So, do you think that there can be patterns in whether it's analyst coverage or the insights and the advisory that they provide you with that can indicate, for instance, if a market is maybe too early to enter or already saturated? Or, for instance, if they have heard if you are acquiring a company, it's maybe not the right time to do that. Can we find
I
those patterns?
I don't know. I don't know that I would use analysts for that pattern. I think, to the point of like analysts are kind of a form of market research. It reminded me of that Henry Ford quote, about like if I had done market research with my customers, they would have told me they wanted a faster horse. Analysts hear what the market wants, and that's it. They hear what the market is asking for today, and they hear what the shortfalls in that are, and they hear what we might want to buy within the next year because we're in the middle of an RFP. But when you're entering a new market, when you're building something totally new, when you're disrupting, I'm not sure analysts are any better than customers at telling you that will work or that won't work. I think you might as well just go to some customers and try to, you've got presumably an advisory board, customers you're potentially selling to who you could co-develop stuff with. Like, they've got more on the line. And so in a lot of ways, they're not sitting in an ivory tower speculating about whether people will be interested in this thing or not. They would live with it. And I think that's much more interesting. So for me, if that's the question, like, should I enter this new market? Should I build this thing or not? I would try to build a simple proof of concept and bring it to actual people who could buy it, because that's just going to get me to the answer much faster.
Okay.
Sorry, analysts. I love analysts, but I think I think analysts are not the right answer for that. The analysts might be a great answer for troubleshooting that, right? Hey, we're having trouble getting traction with the people we thought. What do you think's going wrong? Like that's a thing I would use analysts for. But like, hey, do you think people will buy this hypothetical car thing? I don't know. I think they'd probably just be like, I don't know. All my inquiries last year were about faster horses. I couldn't tell you. That's just a limitation in how humans think, right?
Do you think more and more companies will be asking, and specifically large enterprises will be asking technology vendors for proofs of concept and to do small projects for them before they commit to buying more solutions and more products?
Yeah, I think this is already happening, right? This is how people buy if they at all can. We've already seen software move away from big implementations to, I mean, this is what product-led growth was about, this idea that you can kind of land and then let people expand. If you look at companies like Salesforce and ServiceNow and Zendesk, like big SaaS companies are all designed so that a customer can start small and then grow over time. Doesn't mean that everybody does exactly that. Like, obviously, there are still big implementations of those things, but everything is moved in a direction of, can I start smaller? Can I try it? Because that de-risks a purchase, right? If you think about buying something like AI, I mean, any kind of AI tool, a demonstration of that is not going to tell you what it's going to be like to actually use, right? Not least of which because and I'm speaking as a sales engineer who would be very scared to demonstrate AI now, you don't really know what you're gonna get until you do it, right? The AI is a little bit of a black box, and so living with it and living with it in your world with your stuff integrated with it is the only way to really understand what's this gonna do in my environment. So that's a long way of saying, yes, I absolutely think that there's an expectation among buyers now that we do get to test and try and live with more and more of what our ultimate implementation is going to be. And that, in some ways, like, I think it's a really interesting question then, where do analysts fit in? Because a lot of what analysts have been vouching for is, is that kind of you can trust this company. It will be fine on the other side. We looked at all of the product capabilities and we have vetted that they will work for you. Not for you necessarily, but for, generic customers. Like, this company has these capabilities, right? We saw them in a demo and a questionnaire and whatever and vouch for them. And if you can do a proof of concept and you can see in your company's environment that this thing works, and as software becomes more self-service, you really can do that, right? You can build it for yourself. You can see how you create an integration. You create, a push or a pull with a data source and a process that you need to create. You can do that stuff and see what it would really be like to live with. Then does the need for the analyst's input become less? Because really, I still need to understand what this company's vision is and maybe to have someone vet that they believe that this company is going to continue to be in business, that they're not going to disappear, 3 years from now and I won't be able to use it anymore. And the security stuff is still a thing. Like, will they meet regulatory requirements? Like, there are some things that I would still trust, a third party analyst to do. But I get much more value out of understanding in my unique environment. Can I implement it? Does it do what I want? Can I put the hands of my buying committee on it and let them try their use cases with it? And as more people buy that way, then the need for third-party analysts to vouch for that stuff, I think, becomes less. And so does the role of analysts and analyst relations kind of change a little bit in that world? I think is a really interesting and slightly existential question, maybe for some of us. It's a thing we have to be thinking about because a big part of the role of analyst relations is to de-risk software purchases. And doing a proof of concept inherently de-risks a software purchase. So, I just think it's an interesting thing for us to have our eyes on as analyst relations professionals and to be thinking about.
Perhaps the role of analysts will become in getting into the shortlist because more and more vendors are coming up with whether it's payment, core banking, whatever software it is, the space is no longer reserved for the big companies or for a certain number of companies. And the more companies you have, the harder the choice becomes. And yes, you can have reviews. We know that some of those reviews in certain sites are perhaps encouraged to be given reviews through some incentives.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe this will become the new role of analysts, getting into that shortlist of 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 companies that you can evaluate and you can work with, essentially, and even shortening the shortlist. Maybe that would be the
Maybe. It
future
could
role.
be. No, but it's interesting because the bar to create software is becoming so much lower, right? And so if the major analyst firms are only or if you're not even on their radar as a vendor until you have $50 million in revenue, but I can and I am vibe coding my own little app at home, and I'm not saying it's enterprise grade or anything, but the bar to create your own software at this point is negligible. So, like, is it implausible that software that could meet a real enterprise need could be met at a buy $1 million company or a $5 million company, and it could be enterprise grade, high quality software that is meeting a need and useful and would be recommended by lots of people, but not on the radar of the major analyst firms. Like, I think that's becoming more and more plausible and even likely.
Yes.
And so, it'll be interesting to watch how those firms, you've seen Forrester remove kind of the concept of company size from their evaluations. And I wonder if this might be part of why, because, you don't really need that information to know if a company is going to serve you well. Gartner's, that's not how they think. That's not built into the DNA of that firm in particular. But it's an interesting question, right? Like, if I can put my hands on it and try it and it works in my environment, and I believe the company's going to exist, which is a thing that matters, I don't know that I need a lot more information than that. So I think all of that is kind of changing right now, and it'll be really interesting to see where that goes.